Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see you. Indeed, that's what we're thinking about for our afternoon around God's Word. We're thinking about one particular character from the New Testament, a man called Bartimaeus that we've read about together in that introductory reading. But we're also thinking about sight, both literally and metaphorically. So you could actually put our theme as sort of seeing is believing, which you'll see on the next screen. But just whilst we're here, it just shows how complicated the idea of vision and actually understanding what we're looking at is, how the eye and the brain work together to interpret the world around us, and we'll think about that later on. The picture on the left perhaps is an easy one. You can see how that shape is deforming, but at any one moment it's quite difficult to see what's going on and which bit's inside or outside. And on the right, hopefully you're seeing what's an optical illusion, that the dot appears to be moving around, but actually there's nothing moving at all. All that's happening is that in sequence the pink dots are going white and then coming back to pink, going around the circle, and it makes it look as though there's a green dot actually going round, but that's the way our eyes and our brains interpret the picture that we're seeing. So yes, our thought, seeing is believing, and we're going to see from the life of Bartimaeus how that is the case. So I first did this talk down south in Newbury in a series looking at miracles of Jesus, and I think we're having a series on Jesus' miracles here in Ormskirk as well. It's a bit of a truism about things that we don't know what we've got until it's gone. We take things for granted, and maybe sight is one of those things that people can take for granted, and if we for whatever unfortunate reason lose that sense, find it very difficult because we rely on it so much, don't we? And just some examples there of things that we can visualize, we can understand what they mean to us simply because we've seen them, but try to explain that to someone who has never seen, and suddenly we would be struggling, wouldn't we? We couldn't describe the colour red and why that's different from other colours. We'd certainly struggle. In a month or so's time, when the bluebells are out in full bloom, a beautiful blue haze on the carpet of a woodland, how could we describe that? Or the features of someone's face. Very difficult things to picture and to convey. But people that don't have a sense of sight, often their brains are focused on the other senses that they do have, and they have more capable senses in other ways. Sight is amazing, and we rely on it an awful lot. There's another optical illusion there. I don't know what you're seeing there, whether you're seeing the head of a rabbit or the head of a bird. Those are the two options. One may have immediately hit you as what you're looking at, or it might have been the other one. So we're thinking about a man, though, this afternoon who had no sense of sight. A man called Bartimaeus. Now, it's difficult because he's only mentioned once in the Bible, and we've read about him. But by inference, we know that the same instance in the life of Jesus, it's recorded in the other gospel records as well, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So that these three gospels all record something about the incident of Jesus meeting the man Bartimaeus. But we don't know what happened to him after this incident took place. And so this is an example of where we can look at the gospel records. We can see some pieces which are common, which connect the stories together, so we know that it's a single incident that we're talking about. But because they have slightly different details, we can put together a bigger picture. And we'll see that, as always, the Gospels, they don't contradict. They simply show slightly different viewpoints of the same message. So I hope it'll be a useful exercise just in doing that, as well as we think about this man, Bartimaeus. I mentioned that he appears in 3 of the Gospel records. In Mark, that we've read together, he's mentioned by name, so we know who he is from that Gospel. But in Matthew's Gospel, it talks about 2 blind men. And in the record that Luke wrote, it talks about the incident happening before Jesus then goes to visit a man called Zacchaeus in the city of Jericho. But the context of it, this is towards the end of the ministry of the Lord Jesus Christ, after he spent some time in Galilee, but before he has his triumphant entry into Jerusalem. So a little bit more context. Here we are. So in Mark 10, it says that Jesus is in the coasts of Judea by the far side of Jordan, and then that he's to go up to Jerusalem. And he comes to the city of Jericho. If we were to look in Matthew chapter 19, we'd see that Jesus, the same thing, leaves Galilee up in the north of Israel, and then, the same as Mark says, departs Jericho. And then Luke chapter 17, Jesus passed through Samaria and Galilee, and then came near to Jericho. So we've got one of those occasions where the gospel records, on the face of it, aren't totally gelling together. There's something of an apparent possible contradiction about where this miracle actually took place. But we can see what the common elements are. We can piece together the picture. Jesus has been up in Galilee in the north. He's going to Jerusalem. He goes via the coasts of Judea beyond Jordan, through the midst of Samaria and Galilee, visits Jericho. From Luke's Gospel, as we've said, we know that he visits a man called Zacchaeus there, and then he takes the road that climbs up from Jericho to Jerusalem. Those Gospels, though, said that he came to Jericho, he came from Jericho, he goes past Jericho. Which is right? What makes sense? We probably can piece it together better if we look at a map. If we had a first century sat-nav and we said we wanted to travel from Galilee to Jerusalem, it would probably give us a route something like this, going from the north, from Galilee, continue down the Jordan, turn right at Jericho, and go up to Jerusalem. So you can see that on the map with the red line there. And so Jericho is the sort of the hinge point of that journey. And it seems this was the route that Jesus took. It goes down the coasts of Judea beyond Jordan, probably down the west side of the river itself, as Luke says that he passed through Samaria, which is the area on the west of the river Jordan. And the 3 accounts agree that Jesus went towards Jericho and then continued. I'm going to make that go away. I do apologise. Right, there we go. that Jesus goes down the Jordan Valley, and he's gone through the edge of Samaria, and then gets to Jericho, and then continues up the steep hill that leads to Jerusalem. But it's what happens at Jericho which is the key to understanding what's going on in the sequence of events, and to try and get rid of that apparent contradiction. What do we know? Well, Jesus was coming down from the north. Well, there aren't many settlements down the Jordan Valley. There's quite a gap. Jericho would have been very much the place to get to stay overnight before travelling on. A place where they could get rest, a place with plenty of food and water before walking the difficult climb up to Jerusalem. Just to give you an idea, the climb from the level of Jericho, which is way below sea level, it's something like 800 feet below sea level, climbing up to Jerusalem at 2,500 feet above sea level. So that's a climb of about 1,000 metres. Well, the bigger hills in Scotland are that kind of height. So it's like climbing one of those. Before tackling a climb like that, having walked all the way down from Galilee, it makes sense, doesn't it, that Jesus would perhaps stay overnight, stay and rest before leaving the following day when it's cooler. So I think it's pretty certain that Jesus and his followers would have stayed in Jericho that night. Indeed, it's Luke in his record that says that Jesus stays at Zacchaeus' house in Jericho. It all seems to tie together then. Zacchaeus was a tax collector. He was a wealthy man. He probably had a nice big house, probably plenty of space for the people to stay. So it shouldn't worry us that in Luke's gospel record he completes the account of the miracle before mentioning that Jesus then stays at Zacchaeus' house. Because that happens on other occasions too, in the gospel records, in Matthew 21, for instance, when Jesus curses the fig tree. That actually sort of takes place out of logical sequence in that the whole story is explained before moving on. It's a sensible way to group the information together. So, we've got a bit of a picture going on, but we need to focus in on some of the details. So let's look a little bit more closely at what is going on in and around the city of Jericho. On this other map you can see that Jericho, by the time of the Lord Jesus, has actually moved. There was an old city, old Jericho, slightly to the northwest of the place that had become established by the time of Jesus. Certainly the wealthy people had moved to the new city. This was the place to be. And the road, as you can see on that inset map, the road from the north and the road from Jerusalem join together before going into the new town. So the same gate of the city would serve the roads going up to Jerusalem and the road going up the Jordan Valley through the old city of Jericho. And this could help then to explain some of the other apparent differences between the Gospels. It helps us to piece together these events. So Jesus is approaching Jericho. He approaches the gate, and there's a growing mob of people around him with all the noise and fuss that would cause. And it would sound different from other people just coming and going through the gate of the city. Because this is the gate where two main roads come in, it would also be a very sensible place to be if you were begging from passers-by, particularly to beg from the Jerusalem traffic, because people going up to Jerusalem perhaps would be feeling in a little bit more generous mood to give some help to those begging. So Jesus would pass Bartimaeus once on the way into the city. He'd stay overnight with Zacchaeus, and then he would leave through the same gate, heading back out of the city that way before going up to Jerusalem. So in this case, we can see how all three gospel records can be seen to be accurate, because they're just telling the story from a subtly different point of view, but they do all fit together when we look at the situation in reality. However, there is still a little discrepancy that we need to sort out. That Matthew says that there were two blind beggars, whereas Luke and Mark only talk about one, only Mark, of course, naming him as Bartimaeus. Well, as we've just said, this was a good place for beggars to wait for alms from people passing by. Perhaps particularly, as we've mentioned, for the Jerusalem traffic. So it's very likely that Bartimaeus wasn't on his own. I suspect there was a small group of beggars there. It's very reasonable that Bartimaeus had some companion or companions, but at least one. We don't know why the other isn't named, nor fails to appear at all in Matthew, fails to appear at all apart from in Matthew's gospel record. But Matthew does this doubling up in other places as well. For instance, in Matthew chapter 8, verse 28, when Jesus was come to the other side of the Sea of Galilee into the country of the Gergesenes, there met him two possessed with devils coming out of the tombs, exceeding fierce, so that no man might pass by that way. And in the following chapter, when Jesus departed thence, two blind men followed him, crying and saying, "Thou Son of David, have mercy on us." So it may well be that there are other occasions where incidents occurred where there was more than one person, but other gospel records have focused in on one particular person from the group. While the miracle focuses on Bartimaeus, there's no reason why a second person might not be involved. And perhaps Matthew does mention that to emphasize the message of the miracle, the way that one responded over the other. So, who was Bartimaeus? Well, let's move on to the next screen. We've already started to answer some of these questions, but it sets the scene for us. We only have this miracle to go on. It's the only time he's mentioned by name. We know he was in Jericho, the city of palm trees associated with the Gentile nations. And his name, Bartimaeus, also seems to have a bit of a Gentile flavour about it. Bar is the Aramaic equivalent of the Hebrew word ben, meaning son of. So it implies son of Timaeus. Well, who else do we know with a name like Timaeus? There's Timothy, who had a Greek father and a Jewish mother. The point is that we're getting a name which doesn't sound as though it was entirely Jewish. It could be, we don't know for sure, but it could be that he was had some Gentile ancestry. We don't know how much of the gospel he'd already heard as well. either directly or indirectly. But it's possible that on the way into Jericho to visit Zacchaeus, that Jesus might have paused at the gate where Bartimaeus was waiting, where there'd be a bit more space, and was able there to talk to the crowds of people. We know that there was a great multitude with Jesus, so the narrow space in the city streets would have been a little bit harder to talk to the people there. So if that was the case, then Bartimaeus might have been part of the extended audience that Jesus was talking to. It might even be that Bartimaeus was on his own when Jesus entered into Jericho and spoke with the second blind man that Matthew mentions before Jesus leaves the city and persuades him also to wait for this great teacher to pass by the gate. Well, in any case, what is truly striking is this interaction that we have between Bartimaeus, Jesus, and the crowd of people. Firstly, it's how he addresses Jesus. He says, "Jesus, Lord, Son of David, have mercy on me." One of the things that have been repeatedly brought up by those who opposed Jesus and his teaching was his questionable lineage. If he was the Messiah, he should be the son of David. And they questioned who his father was in very unpleasant terms. They even said things like, "We be not born of fornication," in John 8, verse 41. They refused to see that Jesus was not only son of David and had claimed to be the royal heir, but also, of course, they wanted to slur his character as well. For Bartimaeus, he first needs confirmation that it's Jesus coming past. And the crowd say, it's Jesus of Nazareth. Well, Nazareth was a place that wasn't a particularly good reputation up in the north of the land. And it's interesting then, isn't it, that by contrast to the people, Bartimaeus, he's already being able to see. He can see what they can't. He can see that there's something very special about Jesus, that he is the son of David, the rightful heir. And in proclaiming that, he's setting the stage for what happens afterwards with Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem. And the people then putting palm leaves on the ground, and they shout, "Hosanna to the Son of David, blessed is he that comes in the name of the Lord, Hosanna in the highest." But here Bartimaeus says, "Jesus, Lord, Son of David, have mercy on me." That testimony that Bartimaeus gives as to who Jesus is doesn't seem to be what the crowd wants to hear. They tell him to shut up. But instead he simply shouts more and louder. If we were to look in Mark's account of the incident, it seems that Jesus had gone past where Bartimaeus was sitting. He sort of overshot rather than stopping where Bartimaeus was. And maybe that was part test of faith for him. Was it to see whether he would continue calling out to Jesus, even when it seemed that he'd gone past him? Well, of course, we know he didn't stop calling out until Jesus stops and sends someone back to call Bartimaeus to come to him. And there's a lovely point here that we can draw from in the story, because as well as showing his faith by continuing to call out to Jesus, what Bartimaeus now does is really quite extraordinary. He throws his cloak to one side. I think at this time of the year, first thing in the morning particularly, it could be still very cool. And so if you were unable to see, the last thing you'd do is throw your cloak away, because how would you find it again? And yet he does. He throws it away as unimportant and something that will impede him from getting to where Jesus is. But not only would it be something that would slow him down, it rather suggests that he thinks that if he does need to find it again, he might be able to see where it was. He believed that Jesus would enable that to happen. "What wilt thou that I should do unto thee?" asks Jesus. Well, that seems perhaps a strange thing to ask. It's fairly obvious, isn't it? This is a blind man. But he asks anyway because of the parallel spiritual lessons that are being shown. Just as the blind man must ask to be able to see, so we have to ask for our salvation. It's not something which is just given to us without our asking, without our participation or anything. We have to seek it. And Jesus had compassion, as it says in the record that Matthew has in his gospel, whereas Mark and Luke record that Jesus says, "Your faith has made you whole." But of course, as so often is the case with something that doesn't look to be the same at first glance, this is the record showing us two sides of the same coin. The compassion that Jesus has, that he shows, would achieve nothing if it weren't for the faith of the followers. There's no point of faith without Christ's compassion towards us. And another thing that strikes me about what happens here is that, it's obvious to say it's a miracle, but really this is a miracle. He regains his sight immediately. It does sometimes happen that somebody perhaps has had an eye injury and they've not been able to see for some time, and then eventually things start to reconnect and sight in some way is partly restored. Maybe it improves further over time. But here, Bartimaeus goes from being blind for his whole life, suddenly he can see perfectly. He is made whole. To be able to see, we need more than just our eyes. The eye is amazing. It does an incredible job. We need all of the bits of it to work together. We need, as well as that, our brains to be able to take the signals that come from the nerves that come from the eye and do something very, very clever with those signals. Maybe some of you have a computer at home with a scanner attached to it, which means that you can feed in documents, and the computer can then use special software to take the documents, like save my notes, and read the text off it and turn that from a picture of the text back into actually understanding what the letters and the words are. And maybe it'll even tell you where there's a spelling mistake, so probably better not look at my notes because they're full of them. But that's really clever and powerful. But it's only doing it with something relatively simple. When you think about it, our eyes are doing that with everything we see all the time, understanding the pictures that our eyes are capturing. The brain plays an enormous part in making that work. When we first open our eyes as babies, our brains are being fed streams of images, and at first they don't mean very much. They can be fuzzy and meaningless, but over time the brain develops to work out what it's looking at. For a start, the image that we see on the back of our eyes is, of course, completely inverted and back to front. But we don't see the world that way. It helps us that our brains turn the image the right way round for us. But for Bartimaeus, none of that was in place. He'd never experienced it. His brain-eye system had never worked. It was not just broken, it just wasn't existing at all. But in an instant, Jesus says, "Your faith has made you whole." And it seems that he was able not only to see, but to see perfectly and to understand what he was seeing, for suddenly all of that to work. Jesus really did make him whole. And so he was able to follow Jesus along the road without stumbling, without walking into things. That's absolutely amazing and wonderful. So it's not that surprising that he then ignores Jesus' command when he says, go your way. Don't worry about following me now. Why would he do that when he could go the same way as the one who made it possible for him to see? And so he does go. He goes with Jesus and praises and glorifies God for what's been done for him. And his faithful witness causes others to praise God too. What happened to him afterwards? Well, we don't know anything about him after this miracle. Which is sad, because we'd like to know something, I think, about him. But behind it, there are several themes and messages that we could look at. Writing to the church at Corinth, Paul talks about the eye. He says in 1 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 16, "And if the ear shall say, because I am not the eye, I am not of the body, is it therefore not of the body? If the whole body were an eye, where were the hearing? If the whole were hearing, where were the smelling? But now hath God set the members, every one of them, in the body, as it hath pleased him." The eye is a valuable part of the body, but it's useless on its own. It needs the rest, just as the other parts need it. But its role, being about guiding, giving the brain information, means that it has an influence beyond its apparent size. So Jesus uses it too in his teaching, no fewer than 3 times in the Sermon on the Mount, for instance, recorded for us in Matthew's Gospel. Let's just a couple of those passages. In fact, Matthew and chapter 6. Matthew 6, verse 20. "But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust doth corrupt, and where thieves do not break through nor steal. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. The light of the body is the eye. If therefore thine eye be single, thy whole body shall be full of light. But if thine eye be evil, thy whole body shall be full of darkness. If therefore the light that is in thee be darkness, how great is that darkness?" And in the previous chapter, Matthew 5, verse 28, Jesus says that, "I say unto you that whosoever looketh on a woman to lust after her hath committed adultery already with her in his heart. And if thy right eye offend thee, pluck it out and cast it from thee, for it is profitable for thee that one of thy members should perish, and not that thy whole body shall be cast into hell. And if thy right hand offend thee, cut it off and cast it from thee, for it is profitable for thee that one of thy members should perish, and not that thy whole body should be cast into hell. And in chapter 7 and verse 3, and why beholdest thou the mote that is in thy brother's eye, but considerest not the beam that is in thine own eye? Or how wilt thou say to thy brother, let me pull out the mote of thine eye, and behold, a beam is in thine own eye? Thou hypocrite, first cast out the beam of thine own eye, and then shalt thou see clearly to cast out the mote of thy brother's eye. The eye gives us information. It's our means to be aware of things around us, things which might come our way. And likewise, the Bible uses sight as a symbol of knowing about the future, setting faith as a spiritual parallel to sight. So, for instance, we could look at in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, where Paul talks about us walking by faith and not by sight. Or in 1 Corinthians 13, verse 12, where it says, for now we see through a glass darkly, or we look in a mirror. We didn't have the kind of very reflective mirrors that we have today. In those days it would have been a polished piece of brass or something. We look in that and we see a sort of image, is what he's saying. We look in a glass darkly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then shall I know even as I am known, says Paul. And lastly, there are verses of great comfort to us, that God watches over us. In Psalms, we'll go to a couple of passages in Psalms actually, so let's go and look at that. Psalm 34. The eyes of the Lord are upon the righteous, and his ears are open to their cry. The face of the Lord is against them that do evil, to cut off the remembrance of them from the earth. The righteous cry, and the Lord heareth and delivereth them out of all their troubles. And this is cited by the Apostle Peter in his first letter, where he says, in chapter 3 verse 12, for the eyes of the Lord are over the righteous, and his ears are open to their prayers. So that the same theme there. Let's go over to Psalm 146 now. A psalm which tells us that as well as watching over us, God blesses those that are looking towards him. Psalm 146 verse 8. The Lord openeth the eyes of the blind. The Lord raiseth them that are bowed down. The Lord loveth the righteous. The Lord preserveth the strangers. He relieveth the fatherless and the widow. But the way of the wicked he turneth upside down. The Lord shall reign for ever, even thy God, O Zion, unto all generations. Praise ye the Lord. And finally, we'll go to a verse in 1 Corinthians which shows, I think, the importance of having the right vision in our lives today. We've talked about an individual, Bartimaeus, but it's open to all of us what God has promised he will bring about in the world, the return of his Son and the establishment of God's kingdom here on the earth, and a wonderful future, a wonderful hope for those who put their trust in him in this life now. And here we have in 1 Corinthians chapter 2 and verse 9, that promise described. As it is written, eye hath not seen, nor ear heard, neither have entered into the heart of man the things which God hath prepared for them that love him. Isn't that amazing? For all of the incredible things we've been thinking about the power of vision, the amazing, wonderful things that we can see in the world around us. For all of that, it's not enough to be able to picture the wonderful future that God has promised, as he says, for those that love him. And so our prayer is that we all together have that vision. Seeing is believing. We need to see from God's word the great promise that he has made, and by God's grace and mercy we can be part of it. Thank you very much for listening.